Sysdig is the first cloud-native visibility and security platform that eliminates the need for standalone tools like container security and monitoring. Using Sysdig's unique data approach, enterprises can solve a variety of visibility and security issues at massive enterprise scale for multi- and hybrid cloud environments. Sysdig will enable your organization to scan and block vulnerable images and enforce best practices pre-production, block threats, enforce compliance, and monitor application performance, proactively alert on incidents, reduce MTTR with forensics, and capture detailed audit records, all from a single unified platform. Accelerate your transition to containers and then have confidence in your ongoing operations using Sysdig. To learn more, visit securityweekly.com/Sysdig.
Welcome back to Application Security Weekly. I'm your host, Mike Shima, joined by Matt Alderman. Some of you told us that you are overwhelmed by the amount of content we distribute. In an attempt to make it a little easier for you to find what you're interested in, we've created our new listener interest list. Sign up for the list and select your interest by visiting securityweekly.com/subscribe and clicking the button to join the list. You can also now submit your suggestions for guests in our recently released guest suggestion form. Go to securityweekly.com/guests and enter your suggestions. Attending KubeCon and Cloud Native Con Europe 2019 in Barcelona, May 20 to 23rd, 2019, join your peers at the Cloud Native Transformation Summit 2019, hosted by Sysdig on May 20th. Our very own Matt Alderman will be emceeing the event. Pre-registration is required. You can add it on during your KubeCon plus Cloud Native Con registration. Matt, we just had a great long conversation about supply chain. And this week, some of the news that I saw was not about supply chain itself, but was more on the side of application hardening, so that we're actually building better tools that come into that supply chain.
Yeah, some interesting announcements this week on that front.
Yeah, a lot of two big things with browsers. So Chrome has it's going to start supporting same-site cookies along with some other privacy features. Same site sounds really cool to me because it's going to be hopefully one of those ways to help stamp out a class of vulnerabilities like CSRF. So where we talked last week about React and how React was going to be a way to really get rid of a class of type of cross-site scripting. Same site probably is going to get us, it's at least should be a good shift. Obviously, it's going to take a lot of web application developers a long time to adopt it and implement it. But at least the browsers are now supporting it. So that's a good thing.
Yeah, I think the challenge will be in enforcing this, right? Such that the cross-site request forgery stuff isn't there. But at least the browsers are now supporting this more natively. Chrome's made some really nice improvements here to do a better job of handling cookies and the privacy concerns with GDPR and a lot of the other requirements that are out there. You're seeing now the browsers provide more capabilities here. I guess it's up to the developers to leverage some of the stuff that the browsers are now going to support more natively.
Yeah, it'll be interesting because that was Edge also announced that they have some more privacy controls that they've put into their browser, which of course is encapsulates Chrome. But Edge, like Safari, like Firefox, they were doing a lot of things against tracking prevention, which builds on just not only how they're handling cookies, but other types of one-by-one pixels and these other types of tracking mechanisms. So the browser innovation, it still seems pretty interesting, and it looks like there is a lot of at least good competition amongst the different browsers, basically fighting for the users, to call back to a good Tron quote.
Yes, exactly. I mean, I as soon as Edge came out is when I abandoned Microsoft altogether. It was a combination of that and 8 to 10 and all the interface changes. I'm like, I'm done. I'm a Mac guy now. So unfortunately, Chrome is the browser I think most of us use. A lot of us have Google account like Gmail and other account. It's so convenient to leverage Chrome because of all the support it has across all your other productivity tools from an Office perspective now. It's just like, unfortunately, I think it's the de facto in most cases. I know there's still Firefox users out there. I get it. But if you're a Gmail shop and you're you're doing the stuff that, you're doing sheets, you're doing this and mail and everything else. I mean, Chrome makes it so easy to just use their browser. So it's good to see them enhancing it.
It's good to see that. And it's sort of also that idea of we no longer need to get root on people's systems. We just need to get one of their cookies or one of their credentials into their Chrome account, and wow, game over from there.
Yeah.
But also say, let's give Microsoft some credit, because they were pulling in Chrome for Edge, but they've also now built a sandbox around Linux. So they'll actually run a Linux kernel on your Windows system, which I think, if you and I were talking about this 20 years ago or so, would have been, we'd be waiting for the punchline, or what's the joke here, right?
Yeah, I mean, this was a really interesting announcement, because a lot of the technologies we saw on the container side, a lot of the container security tools, Layered Insight and the others, were all very heavy Linux-based, Unix-based, because we were doing monitoring syscalls at the Linux layer, and everybody was asking the question, okay, well, what about Windows containers, right? And .NET Core had some of those same components, but now they're embedding Linux kernels into Windows, and it gets really interesting now, because some of those tools that were built really to look at just the Unix side of this equation with containers now has some applicability on the Windows side, now that there's a Linux kernel embedded into Windows. And I think this is a really interesting announcement, because you may not have to come up with a different approach per se to monitor Windows containers. If it's got a Linux kernel and that's what you're running, you can leverage some of these Linux-based tools out there and still be able to protect them. So I thought this was a really interesting announcement.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was, looking back, I saw it was great to see Microsoft come up with PowerShell, so that you could actually do, lots of system administration, lots of remote and at scale with command line tools. But then just to see them say, yeah, let's actually put the kernel in there rather than try to just emulate a bunch of these syscalls, or do some sort of pretend POSIX type of interface, just to see that we now have processor virtualization capabilities within chips. So this is, to a degree, pretty much unnoticeable from a performance perspective, that it actually makes sense to do this. The other cool thing about this too, as a shout out to Microsoft, is they've gone in not only in the open source of embracing Linux kernel, but they also open source the terminal that they built to be able to interact with the kernel in their own terminal for their system. So that was pretty cool to see as well.
Yeah, the shift in Microsoft's strategy over the past few years, right? You and I remember this conversation back when you and I worked together at Qualys, right? We thought Microsoft was dead, right? We did. We saw the uptick of Linux coming into the environment. We're like, what does this mean for Microsoft and the Windows operating system? But they've made major shifts, and I think a lot of this has to do with their cloud strategy and moving customers to Azure. They're seeing the expansion into containers, now embedding Linux kernels into Windows operating system. I mean, this is a major shift in strategy for Microsoft, and I think one that will pay off well for them for adoption into Azure and into some of these environments where people would only look at a variant of Linux. And now Windows is making it easier for them to be able to adopt some of this stuff and keep Microsoft very relevant in this cloud transformation. I think that's great for Microsoft and for people who are leveraging, still using Microsoft products.
Yeah, and I think it's just an acknowledgement of where the industry is going, as well as being able to show how to move to what the developers are doing and what they need, rather than forcing them into some strange, Windows native type of parallel to containers, just pulling in the kernel, providing these tools, and giving that nod to open source, saying, let's actually collaborate in the open. Here's how things get built.
Yeah,
and,
they're still building out that trust, but they're moving in the right direction to continue to make themselves very relevant in this new environment. So I applaud them for that.
The other thing that was on my radar this week is also, speaking of open source, was Android. So Android Q is coming out. And basically, one of the coolest things I wanted to highlight here is they're using so many features of LLVm. So LLVm, a competitor now in spirit to GCC, in terms of a compiler and compiler ecosystem, if you will. And I have a personal soapbox I could get on to that I would love to just see all of our software compiled somehow through LLVm, turn on all of the sanitizers, and find lots of bugs early and often just to have cleaner code. But to bring that back to what the Android is doing, they're applying a lot of these LLVm security capabilities or security and supporting capabilities, like their boundary sanitizers to look for arrays, address sanitizers, undefined behavior, integer sanitizers, basically all of these great things, and very intentionally applying them to software codecs, because that's where historically trying to load in a video, trying to load an image, trying to play music, there's all kinds of crazy compression algorithms, there's crazy performance optimizations that these types of codecs use, and it's just rife with security problems. So what they've done is basically say, rather than turn one particular how to receive a text with a video attachment and it becomes the next type of stage fright type of ecosystem-wide vuln across Android, they've taken these codecs, put a bunch of LLVm sanitization around it, and put a bunch of other type of sandboxing around it as well to say, sure, you're going to run a whole bunch of untrusted code here or a bunch of potentially really brittle code, but at least no longer should it be the case that one bad video or one fancily crafted animated GIF is going to create a 0-day or root access on your Android device.
Yeah, and this is going down the path of iOS in some respects, right? Where you can start to isolate the different components. And I think as an iPhone user, that's one of the things I like about iPhone. I know you're in one of two camps. You're an Android guy or you're an iOS guy. What Apple built in being able to isolate code such that it doesn't infect the entire phone is something that I always thought was brilliant, right? And now you're starting to see aspects of that isolation coming into Android, which I think only helps the Android community in better protecting applications on the phone. A lot of hardware platform hardening stuff here, some encryption capabilities and things that I think brings some of the Android protections closer and closer to what iOS does natively in their phones, which could enable even bigger growth for Android over time, because now there's more security kind of features embedded into Android that you could only kind of get with iOS before.
Yeah, I think thinking through this out loud it's a little bit, or maybe even a lot, of that tie back to supply chain, in the sense of how do we build software that some is more trustworthy than others. So it's, here is a codec that is perhaps brittle and we don't trust it, but now we can build a sandbox around it. So we have a way of just handling that codec. Or we also now have capabilities within LLVm to be able to build more ways of finding bugs within the programs themselves, so that maybe it's not even just the supply chain that we're improving, but that build process. So that CI/CD pipeline, where we're going through all of the regression tests, acceptance tests, that hopefully turning on things like these, just as something as simple as address sanitizer and integer sanitizer, can start to find corner cases that might not be exploitable bugs, but are at least helping us to improve the software quality, so that we can get to a point that bill of materials says, yeah, not only was this built by this third party who we trust for these reasons, but this is how it was built. So now we have a manifest that says this software was built in this manner with these additional security-minded capabilities that make it more difficult to be exploited. Now we've signed it. Oh, and by the way, here are all the signed commits from all the developers that were contributing code to it. So now we have potentially not just a way of saying trust this organization or trust this entity, but we can actually go deeper into trusting that process and trusting that binary as well.
Yeah. I added this article. This came out late last week, and I thought it was an interesting announcement of Steve Singh stepping down from Docker. When we were at Layered Insight, we had a lot of conversations with the Docker team, and it's an interesting announcement. Steve was more of an enterprise security guy, and I think one of the challenges Docker has had over the past few years is shifting from open source Docker Community Edition to selling Docker Enterprise Edition. And not everybody has been able to make that transition well. Obviously, Red Hat and what Red Hat was able to do and OpenShift really put a lot of pressures on Docker over the past few years. They brought in Steve from the outside. I think he's a great executive, but he's an enterprise executive. And sometimes that transition from open source to enterprise is a little tough. Now he's stepping down after 2 years. And they went out. He was doing a lot of advisory work with Rob Bearden, who's coming over from Hortonworks. I think this is potentially a good move for Docker in having an executive who's taken open source, made it available to the enterprise, gone public, getting acquired, is probably something that's good. That transition's, I think, been really tough over the past few years for Docker. And, Steve has spent countless hours, really trying to get Docker to the next level. Him stepping down is a shame a little bit because I like him a lot. Like I said, as an enterprise CEO, I think the man is absolutely brilliant, but sometimes it's hard to make that shift from open source over. So Rob coming in, who has some of that experience, hopefully can continue to figure out what to do with Docker. I was hoping John was on this segment because we didn't really do a DockerCon debrief, which was a couple of weeks ago. And I was just wondering, his thoughts on this move, and maybe we can get him next week when he comes back on, is, what kind of shifts is Docker going to make now under Rob, and where do we see Docker going forward? Because I still think they have some work to do in building out the enterprise product, because I still think CE has way more downloads than EE at this point. But just a really interesting move that I wanted to cover because it, like I said, it came out late last week.
Yeah, we definitely should get John's thoughts on this as well as DockerCon. One of the things about this too is that at a higher level, it's also good, heartening to see that there can be enterprise solutions around open source software. Because at the one hand, you could say, well, it's all free, go forth and use it. But then every company starts to struggle with, well, here is a common software dependency problem. How do I build my graph of libraries that I'm using? How do I manage all of these containers? What does it mean to then actually start to secure them so I get some introspection into them, know what is actually installed on these? So there's something to identify in the sense of what are these common challenges different enterprises, different orgs are facing, and rather than them recreate, 1,000 different, somewhat parallel solutions, start to coalesce around something that is a good pattern to build and a good tool that actually solves problems DevOps teams are running into.
Yeah, I always thought Docker and Red Hat had a really interesting opportunity on the supply chain side in bringing more security capabilities into the core platform. And I think that opportunity still exists. You saw Red Hat make some moves a couple years ago with CoreOS and bringing in some of those components. I think there's still an opportunity to do even more of that and building out a stronger enterprise around the container platforms themselves and integrating some of this stuff together. And hopefully that's something Rob can continue to move forward for Docker, because I think the industry would use it if you can bring those components in effectively as part of an enterprise platform. So we'll see how this plays out. But I agree with you. There's definitely opportunity to do more here.
Yeah, something to keep an eye on. And of course, we'll just throw some homework towards John and get him to give us some additional insight and thoughts onto this. I know he has some good ideas.
Yeah, we were texting about it last week when the news broke, and I know he has some interesting thoughts on this. Unfortunately, couldn't join today.
I think the another big thing, and this is something that we could tackle from a couple different angles, is I didn't call out any specific bugs or any breaches this week. So for anybody with their path traversal bingo, going to have to lose that spot because more interestingly was Verizon data breach report. And so this is always, it's been, what is it, 9 years now, 10 years now? But it's a great amount of data that is well presented and comes from, and has a decent, I say decent, has a good methodology behind it in terms of what they're presenting. What they're presenting is what are, how do breaches happen from what they see when they're responding to um, security through throughout what they see and through their visibility is what I'm trying to say, and also make that distinction between an incident and a breach. So incidents are what they're reacting to, and here's when some security control has been compromised or bypassed, and here's a breach when there's a data loss associated with it. And I just found it pretty interesting every year to see, one, how do they present their data? Visually, they do some really interesting things with charts and data visualization, but then they also just build some good stories around it. And I was curious if you had, if anything in particular was jumping out to you, because there's a couple things that I found pretty interesting as well.
Yeah, I mean, I looked at the summary. I didn't get through the full report in this short time frame, but I did go to the executive summary, and there were a couple interesting findings out of here. The first one, which more of a topic for BSW later, is the focus on C-level executives from an attack perspective. I think that's a rise where people are going after the C-levels, which is interesting, right? Because now people are specifically going after not just the ordinary users, but also you see an increase in going after the C-levels. They talk a lot about the cloud here, as well as we move more stuff into the cloud. We see attacks moving to the cloud as well. One of the stats that came out at Global Cyber Innovation Summit is, I think it was a quarter of all the attacks, breaches were in the cloud, but 0 of them were related to the cloud platform itself. So it's still a software thing. It's still in the software. It's still a misconfiguration of your cloud environment, or it's a vulnerability in your software that is allowing the breaches in. It's not the core underlying cloud platform architecture itself. But obviously they're seeing that shift, and we would expect that shift because we're putting more stuff into the cloud environment to run. And then the last one is, obviously payment card web application compromises over physical terminal. More and more stuff going into payment card applications. Again, potentially hosted in a cloud environment. We're seeing more attacks going there. It's easier to go after where the data source is in these applications than trying to do it at the physical terminal devices, which, again, makes sense as we shift more and more into these larger applications. Those were some of the highlights I took out specifically for this show that were, I thought, interesting.
Yeah, and it also speaks to that idea of go to where the money is. So that idea of the fraud, going after payment apps, ransomware, is to a degree there still needs for many of these attacks, there still needs to be some financial incentive or financial reward for doing so, because otherwise it's just time spent. You might as well just go join a bug bounty program and report vulns that way. Also on this AppSec side, one of the things that stood out to me is, and you're right to call out that a lot of the attacks were against clouds, but they were against web applications on the cloud. So it's not to say, it's not the infrastructure is weak. And even so, it's, when we talk about, do we trust the stack or can we trust the people? A lot of the hacking they call out was stolen creds. And so, you don't even need a backdoor if you can get a username and password for whatever the system is, where it is for like a payment provider in the worst case, or you're spear phishing one of the executives, like you mentioned earlier. If you can get stolen credentials, that's the best way into these systems. And that's why I think too, the modern AppSec absolutely just has to have a answer to multi-factor authentication, whether it is something as simple as signing into your email account or signing it, interacting with your CI/CD pipeline. So if you can sign the commits that go into the Git repo, as well as getting, for the DevOps teams, how are they getting, remote access into production systems? If there's not some type of SSH certificate authority, some type of, Duo-based push, or even just TOTP approaches for authenticating these, then that use of stolen credentials is just going to grow and grow because it's the easiest way to compromise.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing this report just reiterates for me is app user data, right? I still need web application security. I need a better job of authentication, identity, and access. And the ransomware is all about data protection. And what this report highlights to me is that those three major components of security are still super critical, regardless of where this infrastructure runs, whether it's running on-prem or in the cloud. To me, it's still boils down to those three legs of the stool. How do I protect my app? How do I protect identity and access to those apps? And how am I protecting data at the end of the day? This report, in its summary, highlights those three main components are still the weaknesses that are causing breaches.
Yeah, and as well as that aspect of just that social aspect. So it did make a positive comment about that it looks like the rate of phishing was going down, but still social attacks were a significant portion after hacking. So AppSec absolutely is important. You need to stay focused on it. But those social attacks are those harder things to defend against because we have fewer technical controls to help protect users.
Yep, agreed. It's a good summary.
Yeah,
I'll have to read the full report and see what other nuggets we can dig out later.
Yeah, I think there's some other stuff to pull out. And I think one final comment I'd put on there too is just the idea of we're talking about, like it mentions backdoors. So there is this aspect of supply chain as well. But also too, it's one thing, even when we were talking in the interview segment, it's one thing to know you have a problem or to know that something is vulnerable and needs to be fixed. What's an interesting conversation is how quickly can you actually patch that? And if you're talking, if you're CI/CD pipeline or you've gone DevOps and you can actually make, one release a sprint at the very least, and even, a release within a few hours, that's a fantastic situation than some other team that's working on, 4 releases a year because they're old school waterfall style development. And the one of the things that stood out here was the time taken to patch. They had a one graph that was everywhere from 70, 30, 60 to 90 days, and just how quickly you can patch improves how quickly or how more secure you can be against these types of attacks.
Yep, makes perfect sense.
But yeah, so that was DBIR. There's some more stuff there to dive into. Let's digest it and think about some future episodes. But anything else that came across your radar?
Nope.
That you wanted to highlight this week?
No, not this week.
Cool. Well, in that case, I want to thank you again, Matt, for joining me this week on AppSec Weekly. I want to thank our guest again, Derek Weeks, who had a great conversation, and I'd like to thank all of you for joining us. We'll see you next week on Application Security Weekly.